Hi, so my name is Nick Longrich. I'm a paleontologist and evolutionary biologist, and I'm going to talk about the taxonomic status of Nanotyrannus lancensis, a distinct species of small-bodied tyrannosaurid. So this is a debate. It is one of the most contentious debates in paleontology. You might argue maybe it's not the most important, and I can see that argument, but I'm going to try and explain why I think it is in fact pretty important, and it is a debate about Tyrannosaurus rex and some fossils referred to Tyrannosaurus rex. And basically there are some small fossils, small tyrannosaur fossils found in the same beds where we find T-Rex. Are these things juveniles of T-Rex or something entirely different? You might have opinions on that, that's fine. I had some opinions on it as well. They turned out to be quite incorrect. I was surprised, but hey, that's how science works. You find out what you thought you knew, you didn't actually know, you find out you're wrong, you moved on. So I'm going to kind of talk about how we came to the conclusion. So this is based on a paper by myself and my colleague Evan Saitta. We published recently in Fossil Studies MDPI. So to summarize what we're going to talk about here today, the taxonomy of the late Maastrichtian tyrannosaurs is one of the biggest debates in vertebrate paleontology. Are these small tyrannosaurs we find in the late Maastrichtian and the western interior out in Montana and Wyoming, are these things juveniles of T-Rex or are they something entirely different? And the current consensus for, going on 10 or 20 years now has been that there is one species, and the species changes as it gets bigger, and that explains why these things don't look quite the same. I'm going to argue that this hypothesis is incorrect. We tested this hypothesis using a number of different lines of evidence, and what we found is that pretty overwhelmingly the evidence suggests that there are at least two distinct genera in the Hell Creek Formation, and they're not even that closely related to one another. So first of all, we looked at patterns of diversity in predator assemblages, and these suggest that multiple species are likely. This should probably be our default hypothesis. Second of all, we looked at anatomy, the anatomical features of Nanotyrannus and Tyrannosaurus rex, and we found that Nanotyrannus lacks features of T-Rex, and it differs in at least 150 different characters in every bone of the skeleton that we looked at, and that there were no intermediates between the two forms. And then we examined histology, and we argue that despite what some people have argued, histology, that is the growth rings of these specimens, argue that Nanotyrannus specimens were not young juveniles. They are relatively old, either subadults, that is nearing full size, or perhaps young adults. And then we looked at another species of tyrannosaur, an animal called Tarbosaurus, to look at growth series, and we show that they don't really look like what's been proposed for Nanotyrannus and T-Rex. And then finally, there's this big question of like, okay, well, if Nanotyrannus isn't baby T-Rex, where is baby T-Rex? And like, funny you should ask that question. I think we can now answer that. And then last of all, finally, kind of the mystery of what are these things if not T-Rex? And the answer, it might surprise you, it surprised me, but there's something rather different. And finally, last of all, like, what does this mean for paleontology? And in some ways, you could argue that this is a very trivial debate. Like, people like tyrannosaurs, they like big, fierce animals, you know. Every 5-year-old likes them. Maybe this debate doesn't really matter that much, but I think it does. I think it has a lot of interesting things to say about both how we understand the fossil record and how science is done. And I think the answer actually matters. Maybe this particular debate is just one species, but the implications, I think, have broader implications for paleontology as a whole and how we understand the fossil record. So with that, Tyrannosaurus rex. Tyrannosaurus rex is one of the most famous species on the planet. Other than, say, Homo sapiens, it's probably one of the best known scientific names. It is one of the most intensively studied organisms, either living or fossil. And we probably know a lot more about Tyrannosaurus rex than most living animals. And that might sound like an extraordinary claim, but consider that like the vast majority of living animals, insects, have yet to be discovered. You know, most beetle species and insect species have never even been found, let alone studied. There are huge numbers of species, things like frogs and lizards in the Amazon, fish and snails in the deep sea that haven't been discovered. Of the ones that have been discovered, most of those, they collect a few specimens, they stick them in bottles in a museum, and no one looks at them. So few species, there are something on the order of 10 million species roughly in the world today. Most of them are not that well studied. And T-Rex has been the focus of dozens of scientific papers, maybe even hundreds. There are dozens of specimens known. They've been intensively studied. And so in a lot of ways, this is a really well-known animal. So it might seem very surprising that this very well-known animal by any standards, not just by fossil standards, that there might be anything so fundamental that we don't know about it, like how many fossils do these specimens really represent? And it might seem crazy that at more than 100 years after T-Rex was first described, we're still trying to figure that out. But I'll argue that we actually know a lot less than we think we do about this animal. So a very brief history of the Nanotyrannus problem. The first T-Rex fossils were found in the American West in the late 1800s, and T-Rex was first named in 1905 by Henry Fairfield Osborn. And about 40 years later, a small skull was recovered from the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. And this was initially compared to Gorgosaurus. It seemed to look a lot like Gorgosaurus, and so it was named Gorgosaurus lancensis by Gilmore in 1946. And it sort of stayed there in literature. Not many people really looked at it or paid much attention to it. And then until a little more recently, Bakker et al. In 1988 restudied this animal that had sort of been forgotten. And they suggested that not only was this animal a distinct species, but it wasn't actually a Gorgosaurus like Gilmore said. Bakker et al. Argued that it was something more primitive than Gorgosaurus, and it would lie outside of Tyrannosauridae entirely, that is, deep to the split of Albertosaurines and Tyrannosaurines, and not actually be on the Gorgosaurus lineage at all. And this was a pretty extraordinary claim, and it generated a lot of interest. But there was one kind of problem here, is juvenile T-Rex skulls hadn't been identified. So it kind of raised the question, you've got like, sort of like you never see Superman and Clark Kent in the same place at the same time. We hadn't seen, we had these, small tyrannosaurs called Nanotyrannus, and we had this big tyrannosaur called T-Rex, and we didn't have any baby T-Rexes, and that sounded really odd. Where are they? Why don't we see them? Well, if they're the same thing, it kind of solves that problem. So it seemed like a very intuitive answer, that if we didn't have these small T-Rexes, maybe these things we thought were a distinct genus were the small T-Rexes. So this idea was put out in a series of papers by Thomas Carr and others. I want to say starting in 1999, don't quote me, that's why you have a paper. We have all those little details cited perfectly, all the citations. And what Carr argued was that the Nanotyrannus holotype was not an adult animal, as Gilmore had thought, and as Bakker and Curry and their colleagues had thought. He argued that based on the bone texture, and there are these little striations in the bones, that these are associated with rapid growth, and that therefore the specimen was not mature, but a young, rapidly growing juvenile. And this juvenile bone texture, and I'm making air quotes for a very good reason, as we'll see later in the presentation, that this juvenile bone texture indicated this animal is a juvenile, and therefore most likely a juvenile T-Rex, and not a distinct taxon. The other argument made was that there were a number of anatomical similarities shared by Nanotyrannus and by T-Rex, and therefore helped diagnose this animal as juvenile T-Rex and not something else. And then more recently, there's been an attempt to try and assemble a growth series and basically link these smaller fossils, and additional ones have been found in the years since, to these Tyrannosaurus fossils and show actually there's a growth series. However, this involves some rather unusual changes, because you have this very small, gracile, elongate skull. It gets moderately large. The skull gets about, these animals get maybe something like 7 or 8 meters long. And then rapidly the skull undergoes these changes and acquires these very different features of the adult Tyrannosaur. And it's such an extraordinary difference between the largest members of Nanotyrannus and the smallest members of T-Rex that Carr invoked an hypothesis he called secondary metamorphosis. And he drew an analogy to teleos fish. There are certain fish that undergo radical metamorphosis, like eels have a larval stage and then they have adult stage, and probably the most famous one is salmon. So when Pacific salmon run up into fresh water, they live in salt water, they spawn in fresh. When they run into the fresh water, their skulls and bodies change. They get these great big, hooked jaws, they get great big teeth to fight with. The back becomes very arched. Some of the salmons, the pink salmon, have a very strong arching to the back. They're called humpy salmon because of how they transform when they get into fresh water. And they look like different species. And it's kind of it does happen in fish, but it's kind of an unusual thing, not really expected or known in dinosaurs, and we'll get into that. But these are the three arguments for making this thing a juvenile T-Rex. That the bone texture says that these things are immature, that there are diagnostic features shared by Nanotyrannus and T-Rex, and that you can create this growth series. And I'll kind of get into this a bit later. A little more recently, this specimen turned up. I believe it was dug up, I want to say in 2006, close to 20 years ago. And it was prepared for a long time, and it's been acquired by a museum and going for study in that museum. But it's known as the dueling dinosaurs specimen because there's a T-Rex or juvenile T-Rex, if you like, or a Nanotyrannus found in association with Triceratops skeleton. And another name for the Tyrannosaur is the Bloody Mary specimen. I don't know how it got that name, although it's a pretty cool name. And it's been argued, Pete Larson of the Black Hills Institute has argued this specimen is a Nanotyrannus. And he's argued that the arms of this animal are very elongate. They're comparable in size to the arms of a much longer Tyrannosaurus rex. This is inconsistent with these animals being juveniles of T-Rex. And he's also argued the skulls are quite a bit different, if I recall. I forget exactly the details of the argument. But he's argued that this thing is not, in fact, a juvenile T-Rex, and the anatomy does not fit that. And then a little more recently, people have looked at the histology. And histology is a very fancy way of studying bone tissue, other tissues as well, but with paleontology, it's basically bone tissue because everything else rots. And in basically chopping open bones and looking for things like growth rings. You can find growth rings in dinosaur bones a bit like tree rings, and use them to date dinosaur bones and figure out how fast they're growing. And in a study by Woodward et al., they cut open two specimens that have been assigned to Nanotyrannus, or juvenile T-Rex if you prefer, and they counted the growth rings. And they argued that these growth rings were consistent with these animals being juveniles of T-Rex. I'm not quite sure I agree with the reasoning here. And if you actually try to plot this out, and this has been done in other studies, the growth trajectories that you get off of these growth rings don't kind of look like they match or can link up to the growth trajectories we see from T-Rex, but we'll get a little bit more into that recently and what we found. So, how do we solve this mystery? How do you solve a mystery in general? Consider a detective. What does a good detective do? Now, in fiction, like Sherlock Holmes, they use deduction, and they use one line of evidence leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and this chain of inference, this line of inference leads you to the correct conclusion, and you catch the bad guy. So, in one of the famous Sherlock Holmes stories, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, they're trying to figure out the crime, and Scotland Yard is baffled, and the investigator from Scotland Yard says, "What are we going to, how do we solve this, Holmes? There just doesn't seem to be any leads." And then Holmes says, "Yes, well, but what about the curious incident of the dog in the nighttime?" And the inspector pauses and he turns and he goes, "But Holmes, the dog did nothing." And Sherlock Holmes says, "Exactly." And the dog did nothing. Why didn't the dog bark? The dog didn't bark because it knew the thief. And that narrows it down. This person had to be the criminal. And that makes a great story in a Sherlock Holmes story. But that's actually kind of a terrible way to do police work. It's great for fiction. But you can imagine there's any number of other reasons a dog might not bark. Maybe it's tired. Maybe it's sick. Maybe the criminal laced some meat with, anesthetic or something and drugged the dog. Any number of reasons. So you can imagine like an innocent person, the owner of the dog being dragged off to, executed or something. It's like, no, it wasn't me. And so it's kind of a bad way to do police work. And in fact, we find that where people are wrongly convicted, it's often based on one line of evidence that's given way too much weight. Eyewitness testimony, for example, is often overweighted, and people convicted on just eyewitness testimony often are falsely convicted because our memories are imperfect. Certain types of expert testimony turn out to be unreliable, and people have been wrongly convicted. So if you base everything on one line of evidence, you might get the wrong person, and yet the right person goes free. So how do you do good detective work? And paleontology is kind of detective work, science is kind of detective work. What a good detective does, I'd argue, is look at all available lines of evidence, right? What do you have available? You've got fingerprints, you've got DNA, you've got soil analysis, you've got surveillance footage, you've got eyewitnesses, boot prints and footprints and things like that, for example. And this does a couple of things. It minimizes the chances of getting the wrong person. One line of evidence might point to the wrong person. Even DNA analysis isn't perfect. It's vulnerable to contamination, or maybe somebody planted the DNA evidence. It's not perfect. It's very close to it, but nothing is. So one line of evidence might point to the wrong person. It is unlikely that all the different lines of evidence will independently point to the wrong person. So you're much less likely to get the wrong person, and you're much more likely to be able to convict them because you can make a very strong argument. And I argue that scientific argumentation ideally works in the same way. It might seem like, one really complex analysis is the best way to make a strong argument. Like, okay, I have this really complex computer model, but it's like, okay, you forgot to carry the two here, everything falls apart, doesn't work. If the basic premises of your model are wrong, or the assumptions or the evidence is wrong, you're going to get the wrong answer. So what do? What you try to do is look at a number of different lines of evidence, and if they all point in the same direction, you can be pretty confident. Even if they're not super sophisticated analyses, I would argue that many different simple analyses and simple ways of looking at the problem will give you a much more robust, reliable, and accurate insight than using one line of evidence. So what does that look like in terms of paleontology in the case of Nanotyrannus? Well, we tried to look at everything. We thought about just putting putting everything on one line of evidence like the histology. We said, no, we'll just look at everything. Ecology, the anatomy, the histology, the development, juvenile specimens, and the phylogenetics. And if it all points in the same direction, we have a much stronger argument that will be much harder to dismiss. And what I'm going to say is, I think we have that here. We have a very powerful argument that Nanotyrannus is in fact something distinct. And I think it's very difficult to dismiss. We might be wrong in one or two of these things. We might have got a couple details wrong. But when everything points in the same direction, I think we're pretty confident. Hey, maybe I'm not Sherlock Holmes, but it's more about kind of how you look at the problems rather than being a genius at deduction, I think. And I think this is a very powerful way of looking at problems, and I think it kind of nails it. So first of all, ecology. Ecosystem structure. It's pretty common in the fossil record to get multiple large predatory dinosaurs. So in the dinosaur park formation, for example, we have the fairly large and robust Daspletosaurus, and we have the smaller and more gracile Gorgosaurus. If you go to Mongolia, you have an animal called Tarbosaurus, and the much more small and gracile Aeleoramus. If you look in the chem beds of Morocco, you have multiple taxa in there, things like Carnivorous, a big abelisaur. I'm trying to keep track of all these darn species. What's the Deltadromius? There's a lot of predators in there. So this is pretty typical. Same thing in the Jurassic. If you look in the Maastrichtian of Africa, this is contemporary of the Hell Creek beds. You have multiple species of abelisaur in there. You have a Tyrannosaurus and some smaller taxa in there as well. So this is pretty typical of predatory dinosaurs assemblages, to where you might argue this is the default assumption for dinosaurs, is where we have a well-sampled assemblage, it typically has at least a couple of big predators in there. This is not specific to dinosaurian ecosystems. While mammals don't get nearly as large as predatory dinosaurs, it's typical in in mammalian-dominated ecosystems to see a high diversity of predators. Now, we don't see this so much in modern ecosystems because, they're all wiped out in the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions by overhunting by humans. So recent ecosystems are generally not good models for really what normal ecosystems look like because they're human disturbed. But if you go and look at the La Brea tar pits, for example, you see a lot of predator diversity there. You see Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, coexisting with American lions, with cougars, with Myrocynonyx, which is called the American cheetah, wolves and dire wolves in prehistoric Africa used to have lions coexisting with cheetahs and leopards and saber-toothed cats as well. So high diversity in predatory dinosaur ecosystems and mammal ecosystems. This is not just a thing that you see in terrestrial ecosystems, but also marine ecosystems. So you go to late Maastrichtian Morocco, where I've done a lot of work. You have a lot of big predators there. You have this giant predator called Thalassatitan. You have this thing called Kinjaria. You have Eremiosaurus. You have Mosasaurus. You have Pronathodon currii, or something similar to it. Very high diversity, maybe 6 or 7 large predators in this fauna. So it's pretty standard to have a lot of predators. if you have a sufficient amount of food there to sustain something, a 5 to 10 ton predator or whatever the heck T-Rex weighed, it was a lot, you probably have enough resources there to sustain smaller predators as well. It would be really extraordinary to have one big predator and basically nothing between that animal and much smaller animals like the dromaeosaurs. We don't know of any ecosystem built like that. Now, what am I arguing? Am I arguing that because the Nemegda Formation and Dinosaur Park Formation had two Tyrannosaurs, that Hell Creek must have? No, but I'm saying that's kind of your default assumption. Now, this doesn't resolve the debate, arguably, but I'd argue that you kind of should start with the assumption there's probably going to be more than one thing there and not be super surprised if you find that T-Rex isn't the only thing. That would be kind of, if not an extraordinary hypothesis, a bit unusual. And, extraordinary hypotheses require extraordinary evidence, and I'd say at least unusual hypotheses require unusual evidence, that we should start with the assumption there's more than one thing in there. So, moving on. Morphology. What does the anatomy show? And what I'm going to argue is many characters differentiate T-Rex and Nanotyrannus. Now, that doesn't necessarily resolve the debate. I mean, a lot of characteristics differentiate adults and juveniles. I mean, baby humans don't look like adult humans. Kittens don't look like cats in their skulls, and so on and so forth. But what I'm going to argue in particular is that if there is a growth series, you'd see that between these two endpoints, they look very different. There should be something in the middle that kind of combines features or is intermediate in certain ways, and we don't see that. So what we did is looked at the anatomy of these animals, to a large degree working off photographs and scans, and also these little models. This isn't like a little kind of like sculpture. This is actually a 1/6 scale scan and 3D print of a Tyrannosaurus rex maxilla. And I mean, in some ways, this is better than the original. Obviously, certain small details I can't see, but it's much more convenient. I can kind of examine this thing on my desktop, whereas I can't easily do that with a T-Rex. It's off in some museum, and even if I go there, I don't want to pick it up and break it. It's quite fragile. So in some ways, these things are better to work with than the original material. And so working with this, also, some kind of scans and photographs of Nanotyrannus. Also got a cast of Nanotyrannus here. This is kind of fun. It's pretty good cast, not perfect, but it gives you kind of the basic shape of the animal. And working with this, kind of try to catalog what are all the differences that we see between Nanotyrannus and T-Rex, and there are a lot. I think we came up with something like 20 different differences in the maxilla alone. I can't even keep them straight. Again, that's why you write papers, to keep all this information, so you don't have to keep it in your head. But there's features like, what's here is like the shape of the antorbital fossa. It's smaller in T-Rex. The accessory antorbital fossa is larger and kind of more anteriorly positioned. It's got kind of this weird sculpture on the side of the jaws that you don't see. It's got fewer teeth. It's got this sort of weird interlocking contact for the nasals, kind of lock the skull together, make it less flexible. The palatal shelves are wider in a different position. There's all these different features. I mean, I could bore your ears off talking for hours about this. If you're really curious, go look at our paper, or even better, look at descriptions of these specimens and cast and original material. But in our paper, we try to lay out all these differences. And the thing is, you can do this basically bone by bone. You can go through and find all these anatomical differences. I have never gone into an animal with the extraordinary level of detail that I have with Nanotyrannus and T-Rex, and it's kind of fun to learn just all these weird little ins and outs of how they're built. And oh, here's this little feature here. And in Nanotyrannus, for example, it has a little lacrimal horn. That is the lacrimal bone in front of the eye. It has a little hornlet there. It's quite low and crescent shaped, but it's got a little hornlet, and T-Rex doesn't. It has this kind of big lump of bone in front of the eye. And that hornlet is excavated by this fossa, which you don't see in T-Rex. The orbital bar is bowed. Its antorbital fossa is well developed on the lacrimal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You get the picture. You can do this bone by bone, finding all these differences. Here's the postorbital, and it's different. It has different contact with the frontal bone. The squamosal processes are different. The postorbital bar is different, yada, yada, yada. It goes on and on like this. Here's the dentary. And the dentary of a T-Rex and Nanotyrannus are quite different. T-Rex is more robust, fewer teeth. Nanotyrannus has a groove here. T-Rex does not. The symphysis is different, and so on and so forth. the point is you can keep doing this and you can come up with an extraordinary number of characters. Something over 150 characters. I wasn't able to look at every single bone because we didn't necessarily have good copies of these bones for Nanotyrannus and T-Rex, but I think if you kept looking at other bones, you'd find more characters. And the postcrania is not that well described for Nanotyrannus yet, but I think if you did go into the postcrania, you would find more features. There's a lot of differences. Again, the issue isn't that there's a lot of differences. I mean, obviously there's a huge number of differences to play devil's advocate between a tadpole and a frog. Doesn't mean they're different species. But here's the deal. There are things that are intermediate between tadpoles and frogs. If we are having metamorphosis, tadpole-frog style, you should see something in between. Kind of like you have little tadpoles starting to grow legs and resorb their tails. And we don't really see that. So a way of quantifying this is an analysis, kind of a quick and dirty analysis we did called UPGMA clustering analysis. We use it instead of cladistic analysis because it gives you branch lengths. Basically, it tells you not just how did two things cluster or multiple things cluster, but how far apart are they. And what you do is you kind of throw all the data in there and tries to group these things into different groups, discrete groups, based on the features they share. And what you see is you get very distinct groups. All the Nanotyrannus kind of cluster together. Then all the T-Rexes cluster together, although the juvenile T-Rexes cluster a little further apart from them. But there's this big gap. There's nothing in the middle. Where are the intermediates? They just don't exist. And this is remarkable. How is this possible if one turns into the other? There should be something in the middle. Kind of like you have things that are intermediate between frogs and intermediate between frogs and tadpoles. There should be something in the middle, and there's nothing there. So this kind of rejects this idea of metamorphosis or growth series. A growth series implies a series, a continuous series. We have two distinct clusters, like they're different species. This is not an artifact of the analysis. We repeated this using a different method called PCOA, kind of plots things out in two-dimensional space, kind of breaks these down into variables down into these other variables. And again, what you see is Nanotyrannus clusters away from T-Rex, and there's basically nothing in the middle. This is very difficult to explain if these are, in fact, adults and juveniles. There should be something in the middle. Actually, let's go back for a second. Oops. Okay. PowerPoint doesn't want me to go back. So histology. What did we find here when we looked at the growth rings? What we found was slow growth, decelerating growth, and low predicted body sizes. So the growth rings, what do we see here? You can just eyeball this data. And what do you see when you look at these things? And some very obvious stuff is like the growth rings are fairly close together towards the center of the bone, and towards the outside of the bone, which is deposited later in life, years later in life, it's more closely spaced together. What does this mean? Well, it means these animals are not growing particularly rapidly when we see these early growth rings deposited, and they're growing even more slowly later in life. And we can graph this out and look at growth rates. And because these are rings, we can estimate the circumference of the bone. They're chopped through the femur. This is a weight-bearing element. Bigger animals need bigger femora. And this correlation means that you can back calculate from the circumference of the bone, you can estimate the mass of the animal. And you can do this ring by ring and see how they're growing. And we do this for T-Rex and for Nanotyrannus. And what you find is that Nanotyrannus is not growing that fast to start out with, and then it starts growing even slower. So it's growing maybe 100 kilos a year, 150 kilos a year, which is like about a human body mass per year. It's, by our standards, it's sizable, but for an animal weighing about 1,000 kilos, it's not massive, 10% of your body mass. And then it gets even slower, and we're growing, a few tens of kilograms or even less per year. So it starts out not that high and then goes down. How does this compare to T-Rex? Well, T-Rex at its maximum growth rates is putting on 500, 600, 700, 800, close to 900 kilos a year. That is almost a ton per year. That is massive. It's basically putting on 1 nanotyrannus worth of mass every year. And after that, then it kind of slows down as it becomes mature. We never see nanotyrannus growing at these rates or even approaching those rates or moving towards those rates. Now, it should be, if it's turning into T-Rex, it needs to start packing on hundreds of kilos per year. And as it gets older, it should start to accelerate its growth so it can grow to these huge sizes. It's not doing that. The growth patterns are completely inconsistent with an animal that is going to turn into this 9-ton behemoth. It's growing quite slowly. It's growing like an animal that's kind of going to mature at small size. We can actually try to fit curves to this data and estimate where the growth will plateau. So it's growing a little more slowly every year. We kind of fit some curves on there. There's different models you can use and try and figure out how big is it going to get. And you can do this with a dog. Like, look at your puppy. How rapidly is it growing every year? You can have a big dog or a small dog. And you can do this with a Nanotyrannus. And basically, there are a number of different curves you can fit. Some are more realistic, some are unrealistic, but we still threw them in there just to show that under any number of assumptions, it's very difficult to fit a curve that will get you an animal that's weighing 8 or 9 tons. Instead, under the more unrealistic curves, you're barely pushing 2 tons. Under what I consider the far more realistic curves, maybe something like 1,200 or 1,300 kilos. And that's for some of the larger individuals. There are other individuals that would kind of max out around 900 kilos, not even 1,000 kilograms. So these animals do not seem to be young, rapidly growing animals. They seem to be, on the basis of the histology on the growth rings, to be relatively mature. Maybe they haven't quite hit full size, but they're not going to get a lot more. They're not going to get a lot bigger than this. They basically are close to full size when they died. So this low predicted maximum size, and here we see it on the same scale as T-Rex, is inconsistent with these animals turning into T-Rex. There was another specimen we looked at, the Zuri specimen, but they did not have a femur to section. I believe we looked at the pubis on that, so we couldn't get mass, but we could still get this general pattern of decelerating growth. So we have 3 different species we've looked at, or 3 different specimens we looked at, rather, and each of them shows this pattern of growth that is decreasing as they're packing on less and less pounds every year. The growth is plateauing. They're not going to become giants. It's just not possible. I don't know how to make this happen. So that brings us to the 4th part of our analysis. The 4th thing we looked at is development. What I'm going to argue is that the growth patterns we know for other tyrannosaurs, and in particular the tyrannosaurines, the clade that includes Tyrannosaurus, just don't fit the model that's been proposed for Nanotyrannus. It doesn't seem to grow like Tyrannosaurines grow, so either it's doing something completely different than all the other Tyrannosaurines, T-Rex is, T-Rex grows in a very different way, or this is not a T-Rex. So the best growth series we have comes from the Nemeg Formation, the best growth series for Tyrannosaurs. And here we have Tarbosaurus adults, smaller animals. These are subadults and large juveniles, and very small animals. And these are young juveniles. And we can assemble this growth series and look at how they change. And the first thing you'll notice is, well, they do change. Juveniles don't look like adults. That's, they look different. And so at least, on the surface, it kind of looks like, okay, well, we have a lot of differences between the young animals and the adult animals. Maybe this is consistent with what's been proposed for Nanotyrannus. So this animal has, for example, the juvenile has bigger orbits, proportionally larger eyes. That's a fairly common developmental pattern. Puppies and kittens have big eyes. That's why they're cute. The snout is kind of more slender. The teeth are not quite as robust, et cetera, et cetera. It looks different. And yeah, I'm not denying that. I'm not denying that animals change as they develop. That's, everybody knows that. But the key thing here is that, but it still looks like a Tarbosaurus even when it's really tiny. So we found a whole bunch of different features that are shared between the juvenile Tarbosaurus and the adult Tarbosaurus that are not seen in, say, Gorgosaurus. So the orbit is larger, but it's still kind of elongate dorsoventrally, like a Tarbosaurus's orbit is. The bar in front of the orbit of the lacrimal is not strongly bowed. That's another feature that you see in the adult. It does not have a big lacrimal horn. The accessory antorbital fenestra is fairly large and anteriorly positioned. It has a fairly low tooth count, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There are a whole bunch of features that say, hey, I'm a juvenile Tyrannosaurine. I'm a juvenile Tarbosaurus. And you don't get that in Nanotyrannus. you don't see these Tyrannosaurine features that you do see in Tarbosaurus. They're just not there in Nanotyrannus. And I think this is an important thing that people kind of forget is, yeah, juveniles are different, but they're still diagnostically juveniles. Kittens are different than cats, but they still look a lot more like cats than they do like dogs. And puppies look a lot more like dogs than they look like cats. And not just at that level, this is true even to the level of breeds. Like if hypothetically, let's say you go to the pet store and you want to buy a pug. And you call up and tell the pet store, yeah, I want to buy a pug puppy. And they're like, great, come on down. And you go down there and then they hand you a dachshund puppy. What would you do? You say, oh, well, clearly there's a lot of changes between the adult and a juvenile. You're like, no, this doesn't look anything like a pug puppy. This is clearly a dachshund. What are you trying to do? And if the pet store owner said, well, yes, you see, there's clearly a lot of differences. There's all this changes of ontology and secondary metamorphosis. You say, no, you're trying to scam me. This is clearly not a pug. And the same thing is true for dinosaurs. Yeah, the juveniles look different than the adults, but they still show some of the diagnostic features, not all of them, but at least some of the diagnostic features are present in juveniles, just like pug puppies look like pugs and dachshund puppies look like, at least in some ways, like adult dachshunds. So you can tell. And the fact that we don't have that in Nanotyrannus, there are basically almost no, if any, features in Nanotyrannus that link it to T-Rex, I'd argue is inconsistent with the idea that these things are undergoing secondary metamorphosis, and Tarbosaurus is kind of the test for this. I came across this little bone that gave me pause. It was quite a while ago, over a decade ago. I was going through the collections at Berkeley and just looking through random drawers. I might have been looking for Microraptorines at the time, I forget. But I came across this thing and I recognized that, ooh, that's the frontal bone. And ooh, that's the frontal bone of a Tyrannosaur, but it's really tiny. And I was like, what is this thing? Is this a juvenile T-Rex? Is this a Nanotyrannus? Is it something else? And for the longest time, I didn't know. But in the middle of this project, as I'm learning, going through the anatomy, learning all the details of Nanotyrannus skull morphology and T-Rex skull morphology, I said, let's go back and look at this frontal and see what the heck it is. And I came across this little bone that gave me pause. It was quite a while ago, over a decade ago. I was going through the collections at Berkeley and just looking through random drawers. I might have been looking for Microraptorines at the time, I forget. But I came across this thing and I recognized that, ooh, that's the frontal bone. And ooh, that's the frontal bone of a Tyrannosaur, but it's really tiny. And I was like, what is this thing? Is this a juvenile T-Rex? Is this a Nanotyrannus? Is it something else? And for the longest time, I didn't know. But in the middle of this project, as I'm learning, going through the anatomy, learning all the details of Nanotyrannus skull morphology and T-Rex skull morphology, I said, let's go back and look at this frontal and see what the heck it is. And it turns out it is, in fact, not a Nanotyrannus frontal. And that can't be explained by size because we have Nanotyrannus frontals that are about the same size or even slightly larger, and they don't look like this Tyrannosaur frontal bone. They're much more elongate. They're not constricted anteriorly. The temporal fossa or the adductor muscles attached is very distinct. This thing, it's very short and wide like a T-Rex. It has very narrow contacts for the nasals, indicating pinched nasals like a T-Rex. There's this very S-shaped border of the supratemporal fossa where the muscles are expanded and coming forward on the skull to give it a powerful bite like a T-Rex. So it doesn't look like an adult T-Rex, but it has a lot of T-Rex features as you might expect in a juvenile T-Rex. And you can link it into this is a very, not a great growth series. I got 3 specimens here. We have a really tiny Nanotyrannus-sized frontal from an animal maybe 5 or 6 meters long. We have this larger frontal from the Los Angeles County Museum juvenile, and then adults, and you can basically link them together and see how one transforms into the other. So we have a juvenile T-Rex. Okay, it's one bone. So what? Even one bone is fatal to the hypothesis of a growth series. If you're saying there cannot be any small things that look like T-Rex because Nanotyrannus is juvenile, if I can find one thing, even just one bone, that doesn't look like Nanotyrannus and it's small and it looks like T-Rex, that's kind of game over, I'm arguing. That's completely fatal to this hypothesis. I mean, yeah, I'd love to find the complete skull of a baby T-Rex. That'd be the find of a lifetime. I doubt I could, I could spend the rest of my lifetime, and I could spend the rest of my lifetime prospecting in Montana and never find that. But you kind of got to go with what you got. Museums give us, access to what people have found over hundreds of years. And you go in there and yes, lo and behold, we have a juvenile T-Rex. It's not super complete, but the frontal is extraordinarily diagnostic. You can easily get frontals down to, genus or even species level. This is diagnostic T-Rex, and it's a juvenile. And I'd argue that this bone alone is completely fatal to the hypothesis that Nanotyrannus is juvenile because, hey, I've got the juvenile. Where's the baby T-Rexes? They were here all along. So last, phylogeny. Nanotyrannus is not a T-Rex, I'm arguing. So what the hell is it? This is a really good question. I'm not 100% sure, but I don't think it's like, oh, it's a slightly different species or different genera. No, I think this is something really, really different. And I wish I could say that was my genius hypothesis. No, Bakker figured that out. Like a lot of clever ideas, Bakker came up with it. And so it's something very, very different, I'm going to argue. So we threw Nanotyrannus into a cladistic analysis. We coded up all the features of the anatomy. We let the computer try and figure out the most parsimonious arrangement of the species based on these characters. And what we come up with is Nanotyrannus goes down near the base of the Tyrannosaur tree. So we have a split between Gorgosaurus going this way and T-Rex going this way and all the Tyrannosaurines like Tarbosaurus and Daspletosaurus. Nanotyrannus actually goes outside that, just above the Aleoramines, this very primitive gracile group of Tyrannosauroids from Asia. I'm not 100% convinced of that. Could it be related to the Aleoramines? It's not impossible. Could it be more primitive than the Aleoramines? Maybe. I feel like I'd probably need to look at more specimens and learn the anatomy a bit better. Could it be related to something like, say, Dryptosaurus, these primitive East Coast Tyrannosaurs known from about the same time? Sure, maybe. All of these are possible. But what's not possible is for this animal to go with T-Rex. The anatomy just does not support that. Could this be the result of a juvenile animal not having the advanced features of the adults that you see in an adult T-Rex? This isn't impossible. As we see in Tarbosaurus, some very advanced features like this highly constricted orbit appear quite late in life. I don't think that's what's going on. I mean, first of all, it's not a juvenile. We've looked at histology. These are young adults or subadults. They're not juvenile animals. But the other thing we did is we looked at characters that were ontogenically stable. That is, these are characters that don't change radically over the course of the animal's lifetime. And we found these characters by looking at Tarbosaurus and said, okay, what's kind of stable between these very small juveniles, the skull about a foot long, and these great big adults? What characters code the same in the juveniles and the adults? And these are stable characters and therefore are unlikely to mislead us. And we just code Nanotyrannus for those characters. And still what you get is it still comes out being very primitive. It doesn't have, again, Tarbosaurus has at least some advanced features show up early. And none of those features are in Nanotyrannus. So it really just cannot be, it can't be a function of this animal being immature. It's genuinely a very primitive animal. That being said, some people have argued, are you even 100% sure that all these Nanotyrannosaurs are actually the same thing? No. Shouldn't you do a specimen level phylogenetic analysis? Yes, I should. It was a pretty involved project, though. I think the paper is already like 60 or 80 pages long. I'd love to do it. We just kind of ran out of time. But it is definitely something someone should look at. But these things, there are some really interesting differences in these animals. I do think they're all related to one another. They do share certain features that are derived features, like they have kind of the teeth point forward. They have these kind of buck teeth. The teeth kind of project forward, and you don't see that in the Tyrannosaurs. This seems to be a derived feature that unites these Nanotyrannosaurs. The various different specimens referred to Nanotyrannus. The premaxillary teeth are unserrated. That's another feature. There may be a couple of other things. Mostly they're just super, super primitive, but they've got a couple of features that kind of help pull them together. That being said, there are some unusual differences. You can see that the holotype skull, the one from the Cleveland Museum, the original Nanotyrannus, the skull is a bit deeper in front. The jaw seems to be a bit deeper, and the jaw is not quite as upturned at the end. So as this other specimen, this Jane specimen that was more recently discovered. Could these be species level differences? I think it's entirely possible. Most of the Nanotyrannus actually seem to look a lot like Jane, and the holotype one is the only one that really looks like the holotype, at least that I can tell. I could be wrong. It needs more study. But there do seem to be some differences. And then if you look at this new animal, the dueling dinosaur specimen, it's really weird. Like Jane, the snout seems a little more elongate, but even more elongate. The lower jaw seems very narrow and very upturned, very graceful. It's this really long, weird skull that almost looks like an Alioramus. And this is kind of, pretty clearly not a T-Rex. Is it a Nanotyrannus? I don't know. But there was an animal called Stygiovenator molnari. And Stygiovenator is just a super cool name. What a badass name. And Stygiovenator, there's been a lot of debate about what it was. They thought it was a thing called the Blisodon. Then they made it Stygiovenator. And then it was recognized as being a juvenile and assigned as a juvenile T-Rex. Now, it's very small. So clearly Stygiovenator is a juvenile. But is it a juvenile of T-Rex or a juvenile of Nanotyrannus or a juvenile of something entirely different? And I think Stygiovenator, even though it's juvenile, might be a different species related to Nanotyrannus, but not a Nanotyrannus, that Stygiovenator might be valid. And okay, well, but it's an invalid species, it's named on a juvenile. But again, juveniles can be diagnostic. A juvenile, a young pug, a pug puppy is clearly a pug and not a dachshund or a golden retriever or a Doberman, right? And so there are these weird features that you see in Stygiovenator that are not seen in anything else in North America, but are shared with the dueling dinosaur specimen. So is dueling dinosaurs an adult of Stygiovenator? Again, I don't know. I just think these are questions where we just need to look at this a lot more carefully, find more specimens, describe what we have in a lot more detail, and kind of look at these issues. And maybe in 5, 10, 20 years, we'll know a lot more than we do now. So last of all, I kind of want to go back and look at where did we take this wrong turn? So for close to 20 years, the prevailing wisdom has been that Nanotyrannus was a juvenile T-Rex. If it's not, how was it that we got the wrong answer on this? And there's a couple of different places where I think we just kind of misread the evidence. And I got this wrong too. It's not, I don't know. I mean, and it sucks to be wrong. You think you know something like, oh yeah, clearly this is how it was. Nanotyrannus is a juvenile. And you're like, wait, what? I got that wrong? It's not fun to admit you're wrong, but it's also kind of liberating. It's like, wow, cool, I learned something and move on. And being able to swallow your pride is a valuable feature in a scientist. And I kind of had to swallow my pride. I thought I knew what was going on with Nanotyrannus. It turned out I had no clue. And now I know what's going on, which is way more awesome, right? So it's like, yes, but where did we go? Where did we go wrong, and how did we take this wrong turn? So first of all, the juvenile bone texture. Surprise, surprise. Hopefully it's not a big surprise to you because I've been making air quotes the whole presentation. This juvenile bone texture is not juvenile bone texture. And we can find other animals. There are specimens of Daspletosaurus. I want to say Albertosaurus. Again, look at the paper. We go into all this stuff in detail. But there are large Tyrannosaur specimens that show the juvenile bone texture. And this animal, for example, this is Bistia versicelii. It's a Tyrannosaurine from the Kirtland Formation, I believe, of New Mexico. It's a large animal. The skull is about 1 meter long. It probably didn't get a lot bigger. I mean, it's not as big as T-Rex, but it's basal early Tyrannosaurine and wouldn't have gotten that big. So this animal is either at or near full size. And yet it shows the juvenile bone texture in the antorbital fossa, in the same place you see it in Nanotyrannus, on the back of the skull, on the back of the jaw. We see these striations. So what does this mean? Well, it seems like the juvenile bone texture persists until pretty late. It doesn't really tell you that an animal is a juvenile. It might tell you that it's not fully grown, that it has a little bit of growing left to do, but it's not a reliable indicator of age. So juvenile bone texture is a misnomer. It indicates rapid growing bone, but at least at some point in life, but it does not seem to tell you that this animal is going to get a lot larger. So that's one of the mistakes. It's just this idea. It seemed perfectly reasonable, but it's never been ground truth. No one had actually gone out and shown. In fact, yes, this does correlate with being a young, rapidly growing juvenile. So that's the first mistake. Another mistake is that a lot of the features that were supposedly uniting Nanotyrannus with T-Rex because they weren't seen in Albertosaurus were in fact more widely distributed in Tyrannosaurids and Tyrannosaur. And so basically these are not diagnostic of T-Rex. Again, go and check out the paper if you want a detailed list of these features. Phil Curry noted the same thing. Again, a lot of what I'm saying here is not like some radical new stuff. It's things that people like Bacher, Curry, and Larson have been saying for a long time. I'm just kind of assembling a lot of these ideas and kind of building on it a bit. But a lot of this isn't new observations. And the idea that these characters are not T-Rex characters has been noted before. And again, check the paper, look at these characters. But a lot of these so-called T-Rex features are not restricted to T-Rex and therefore do not prove that this thing is T-Rex. Another issue is that if you go back and look at the figures, some of the anatomy that makes it look very T-Rex-like is just not like that. And I love these figures. They're beautiful pencil drawings. But they've been kind of like, redrawn to kind of correct the specimen in a way that doesn't really need correcting. So kind of the most obvious thing here you can see in dorsal view is that the holotype of Nanotyrannus has been reconstructed as having a very wide muzzle. It just does not have this. Categorically, this is not how Nanotyrannus is put together. Here's my cast. And a lot of the fine details are not super evident in this cast, but the overall shape is very evident. Notice how long this skull is and narrow it is. It's got this blade-like snout. It almost looks like a velociraptor or something, or a greyhound or something, not like a T-Rex. It does not have a wide muzzle. It's got a very narrow blade-like muzzle. Could this be crushing? Again, categorically, definitively, and in all ways, no. Why do I know that? Well, because the palatal shelves, here you have these palatal shelves that kind of come in on the maxilla. T-Rex has these great big palatal shelves that kind of come in to create this massive vault of the palate. So it's got this really wide muzzle. Nanotyrannus lacks that. It's got a very narrow palatal shelf. So you take your two maxillae, you stick them together, you get a blade-like snout. That's just how this animal is built. It's not distortion. This is really how it's built. It's got this very long, narrow snout. Also, the premaxillae here made the kind of broad and U-shaped like in T-Rex. It doesn't have that shape. Again, beautiful drawings, but in attempting to correct them, it's actually pushed us away from what the animal actually looks like. Made it more T-Rex-like in a way that it's not. Again, here in lateral view, there are a few other features. The premaxillae are made shorter. Again, that short U-shaped snout like a T-Rex. And the actual specimen are much more elongate in lateral view. The teeth are here shown as going downwards. In fact, they project forwards in the holotype specimen in the original specimen. This is a diagnostic feature of Nanotyrannus, or at least Nanotyrannus-like animals. They all seem to have these forward-pointing procumbent teeth. Also, the accessory interorbital fenestra has kind of been put a little bit more far forward like in T-Rex. It doesn't really sit there. So the anatomy is actually not as T-Rex-like as it's made out. And again, a lot of people say, oh, well, go back and look at this paper. Well, I have gone back and looked at this paper. And what I'm going to argue is that some of the original observations just don't hold up to scrutiny. And again, you kind of like, again, in general, you want to trust the literature. That's why it's there. You don't necessarily want to repeat every single observation. But when you're dealing with a really highly controversial subject, we have two completely different views that are completely incompatible. You kind of got to dive in there and say, okay, I'm going to go back and look at the original observations. Is Bacher full of nonsense? Is Curry full of it? Does Larson not know what they're talking about? And in fact, I was looking at their stuff. It holds up really well. And it's the case where some of these arguments made for synonymizing Nanotyrannus and T-Rex, these are places where I really just could not repeat these observations. So it's not built like this. I could be wrong, but go back and look at the original specimens, not the paper, would be my argument. Again, I could be wrong, but I mean, this is the thing in science, right? People like to say, oh, listen to this paper, listen to this authority. The only authority that is never wrong is nature. Nature is never wrong. Well, I'm never wrong, obviously. Well, I'm wrong all the time, obviously. So scientists get it wrong all the time. That's why you have to keep doing science. Nature is never wrong. So when you're in doubt, go back and look at the bones. Don't listen to me. Go look at our paper, and if you don't buy our paper, go look at the bones. I'm just saying, I'm not saying I'm right because I'm right. I'm saying, I think I'm probably right because this is what nature says. This is what the bones say, that this is not a T-Rex. Okay, so why does it matter? Is this really serious science? I mean, T-Rex is just, why does it get so much attention? I mean, because every 5-year-old T-Rex is their favorite dinosaur. Everyone grew up knowing what T-Rex was. Watching T-Rex eat tourists on Jurassic Park. It's kind of a bit of a celebrity dinosaur. And does this really matter from a scientific standpoint? And I think it does, actually. Why does it matter? Well, because despite the fact that T-Rex has a sort of celebrity status, and it gets a lot of study, and a lot of work has been done on this, we've somehow managed to get this wrong. And what does this tell us about paleontology? I think we may be dramatically underestimating dinosaur diversity. And species identification isn't high-impact science. Naming a new species isn't the type of thing that gets you a Nature, Science, or Nobel Prize. That being said, we have these kind of big, important ideas, things about how does evolution work, extinction rates, mass extinctions, biogeography, are there more species here, and why, ecosystem structure, latitudinal gradients. All of these things depend on first counting species and saying this fossil belongs in this species, this fossil belongs in that species. So this is the foundation, this is the ground level upon which this cathedral of theory and ideas and inferring patterns and process, all this starts with saying this fossil is a T-Rex, or it's it's an ammonite of this species. I don't know my ammonite species very well. But it's all about identifying these things, right? If we want to see how diversity changes and why it changes over time, we need to be able to classify things. So are we doing it wrong? And in particular, are we underestimating diversity? And I think we might be. Just because we're underestimating modern diversity, we have a lot to work with. I mean, they found a new species of small cat in the Amazon. Cats are pretty conspicuous. They get a lot of study. They're cute animals. Biologists like to work on them, and yet we underestimated cat diversity in the Amazon. We're finding new species of monkeys and birds and frogs and lizards and snails and everything. If we're not even getting it right for the modern biota, where we have the specimens, where we can see it with our binoculars and sequence the DNA, are we undercounting for the fossils? And I think we might be substantially. And what are the implications of this? For example, could there be a lot more species going out in the asteroid hit at the end of the Cretaceous than we think? You look at the clams and say, okay, 80% are disappearing. Well, if we don't even know how many species are there, how do you know it's 80%? Why is it not 90% or higher than that? And it might well be. And again, I'm not saying all this work is useless, but I'm just saying we kind of need to take these things into account. We know a lot less about diversity than we think. We don't even understand the modern stuff. T-Rex, we have a lot less to work with, but it's by fossil standards, we have a lot to work with. And it's very well studied, and yet we still, how many species is T-Rex? 2? No, more than 2. T-Rex itself is, there's at least T-Rex, T. macraensis, which we described recently, maybe another species in there, T. imperator potentially, whatever the heck the thing is in the Javelina formation, so that might be 4 species. Then how many is Nanotyrannus? Nanotyrannus, Stygivator, maybe another thing. I don't know, could that be 7 species? Maybe. I wouldn't bet you $1 million it is, but I wouldn't bet my life there's not 7 species either. We don't know. And then extrapolate that across all these different dinosaurs. There are something like 700 dinosaurs named. If we could sequence the DNA of all those specimens, we can't because DNA degrades, but if you could, what would you find? Would those 700 species be 800, 900, 1,000? 1,500? Would you double diversity in it? I wouldn't be terribly surprised if they actually represent twice as many species as we think. So we might be underestimating diversity, and that has a lot of implications. So I think we just know a lot less about fossil diversity than they think. The taxonomy of T-Rex is not the most important problem in paleontology, but it is a very conspicuous debate, one that's gotten a lot of attention and a lot of study. And yet I'm going to argue that we got it wrong for decades. And by we, I include me. I got it wrong. I thought for the longest time that, it made sense that this is a juvenile T-Rex. And diving in there looking at the fossils, it's not. So this kind of raises the question, what else are we getting wrong in paleontology and evolution? I think maybe we're a bit too confident sometimes in our data. We know a lot less than we think we do. And I don't want to be a nihilist and say, oh, it's all meaningless. We believe in nothing, Lebowski. But I want to say that, maybe we should open ourselves up to the idea that there's a lot we don't know and still a lot we need to refine our ideas of, and maybe we don't know quite as much as we think. And in particular, I think we might be dramatically underestimating the diversity of fossil ecosystems. And not just dinosaurs, but everything. Trilobites, ammonites, clams, etc. And I think that's kind of cool. There's just like a lot of species out there to be discovered, that life was far more prolific in its diversifications, and perhaps these extinctions were far more catastrophic than we think. And I think that's why this matters and why I think it's an important debate. So that concludes our lecture. Take care and thanks for listening.